Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going to be looking at the Pledge of Allegiance. Chris, this is something, the Pledge of Allegiance, if someone grew up in the United States, they could probably say it in their sleep. But the history of the pledge, how it came to be, the changes it's gone through, even some of the controversies that have been connected with it, people probably aren't that familiar with that aspect of it.
Yeah, I think, I remember I was reading a book that had nothing to do with the Pledge of Allegiance, but it brought in the Pledge of Allegiance. And one of the things that it was talking about was how people struggled with the Pledge of Allegiance. And Ray, it was commonplace. We still do it every day in school systems and even in churches and in public arenas. The Pledge of Allegiance is something that is rote by nature. But you're absolutely right. I guess it just didn't dawn on me how many people really struggle with the whole Pledge of Allegiance. And when I say struggle with the Pledge of Allegiance, I'm talking about those who struggle with saying certain parts of the Pledge of Allegiance, but also people who struggle with those who don't say the Pledge of Allegiance.
Mhm.
It has become, about as divisive as, say, the Star Spangled Banner nowadays.
Yeah, it's definitely a touch point for some people where, you know, not responding properly to the pledge can catch you some heat in our society right now. So the Pledge of Allegiance is not as old as the Star Spangled Banner. Star Spangled Banner, of course, goes back to the War of 1812, and but the story of how the Pledge of Allegiance came about is very interesting to me. It all centers around President Benjamin Harrison. This was it, 400th anniversary of Columbus, and a young man by the name of Francis Bellamy, who's an interesting character, one within himself.
Yeah, and I think going back to that, you have this idea of wanting to create a patriotic program, a
Mhm.
that is not it's not just centered in Boston or in New York, but that it is a national um, program that coincides with the opening ceremonies to the World's Fair that's happening in Chicago, but also the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus' arrival in the New World. So, just stop right there. When we say that originally the idea of a Pledge of Allegiance was brought forth to honor, celebrate, observe Christopher Columbus, that in itself in today's society will cause people to question the whole meaning of it, because when if you go back in history you didn't know but should, and you look at the life of Christopher Columbus, you recognize that, wow, I don't know if he was really someone I should be proud to celebrate, or proud to honor. So the roots of this does come from something as divisive as Christopher Columbus and his arrival into the New World.
Yeah, they were really looking at what was it, the World's Fair? Was that?
Yeah, yeah. The Paris had the World's Fair, and they had done a splendid job. I mean, you have the construction of the Eiffel Tower, and that's huge. And so, Chicago has won the prize to host the World's Fair, and they're wanting to really. I mean, it's all about nativism, if you will, because America needs to be better than the French in even in things such as the World's Fair. And so they're trying to get all of these different things put together in Chicago that will cause the world to see that, oh, the United States really is a power force. And one of those being, well, let's do this large thing that is required by all public schools, and come about, and we'll pledge allegiance
Mhm.
to a country. And, talking about the individual who basically comes up with it, Francis Bellamy, his upbringing brings some added interest into him being the one that designs this program in itself, because Ray, once again, you're going to see religion have a major play in this.
Yeah, and the year here we can't let the year just slide by. It's 1892. We're barely just a few years outside of the Civil War. I mean, it is not long. And America is, following the Civil War, you have Reconstruction and all that went into that. America is wanting to feel good about itself again. There's a sense in which there needs to be some sort of patriotic fever that comes about. So this young Francis Bellamy, he's put in charge of coming up, like you said, with this patriotic program. And it turns, and then he sits down and he pins this Pledge of Allegiance to the flag or to America, and it ends up, taking the nation by storm.
And I think there's a couple of interesting things that go with that. In the first one being that Bellamy is this individual who is a preacher's kid from upstate New York. He's educated in public schools. He is a very gifted speaker, and and what happens is he decides that he's going to follow his father's footsteps. He's going to go and become a preacher, and he does that. And things are going well, but Ray kind of just recognizes, kind of as he's pastoring churches in New York and Boston, he says, this just really isn't what I want to do. I want to do something different and something that's a maybe far more reaching. And so he decides that he's going to go work for one of the people that's actually in his church. He was a owner and editor of a family magazine that was known as the Youth's Companion. And all of a sudden, Francis Bellamy goes from pastoring a church of a couple of hundred to being part of a magazine that had about 500,000 subscribers all throughout the United States. And he is given the task of promoting the magazine. And, he's trying to find a way to promote the magazine. And he says, well, I'll promote. And the way I'll do it is I'm going to organize this patriotic program. And it just so happens, as you mentioned, 1892, we have that because it is in response to the Civil War. I really like the way that you said that earlier, because that was ugly, and we not only embarrassed ourselves, but we were an embarrassment to the world. And there is this crisis of loyalty, if you will, and you add into that, you have 1865. We're now in 1892, but now we're also entering into, here's where we're talking about a Columbus Day ceremony, where we're going to celebrate Columbus coming into the New World. And yet the other issue that now comes in is we're starting to see immigrants come in, and there's all of this idea of what is loyalty and what is allegiance and what does it mean to really sit there and give allegiance to something. And so Bellamy sits down, and I think it's interesting. He's able to write this in about 2 hours. I think he said it was about 2 hours of arduous mental labor. And he wanted it to rhyme. That's that oratory that he had, and he wanted it to rhyme. And Ray, he does not present the Pledge of Allegiance as we know it today, but it's a little bit different, and then it's going to get modified as the years pass. But I think the symbolism and the essence of what he's trying to say is found in those brief few words that he puts in.
Yeah, and you mentioned it wasn't the pledge that people are familiar with today. Even the first line was different than what it is today. It's I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. But what he wrote there in 1892 was I pledge allegiance to my flag. And that's the way he writes it initially, of course, just with the assumption that my flag refers to the American flag. And of course, that's going to be challenged and ultimately changed. I think it was in the early 1920s. It's going to be changed to I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands. But when Bellamy first wrote it, it was I pledge allegiance to my flag and the republic for which it stands. So that second part, people are probably more familiar with, but that first part was slightly different than what we're used to today. And of course, as we're going to see as we go through here, the pledge does take on several more changes between the 1920s and to what we're familiar with today.
I think it's interesting. I was kind of reading a little bit about Bellamy, and it is said that the first time that he heard his words put, from paper into vocal was, I think in Boston,
Mm-hmm.
4,000 school children who repeated the Pledge of Allegiance for the very first time. And, I mean, can you just imagine what Bellamy must have felt as he heard those children start to say the pledge as he had written it. However, let's start looking at some of these changes, because I think it's very interesting, as you mentioned, in the early 1920s. You have the first what's known as a national flag conference that comes about, which is from the American Legion and from the Daughters of the American Revolution, who come in and they say, hey, I really like what Bellamy did. He did a really good job, but it's kind of confusing because he says, I pledge allegiance to my flag. And really the question is, well, who's his flag? And what about, we have all of these immigrants that are coming in. And so we need to make sure that we clarify what the meaning really is intending, because they were concerned, and the Daughters of the American Revolution, the American Legion, they were concerned that if immigrants begin to start repeating this, they might be thinking they're pledging allegiance to their previous country. I pledge allegiance. I was from Egypt, so I pledge allegiance to Egypt rather than to the United States. And so they really wanted to go ahead and make it, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States. And then later on, they even had to add of America in that for more consideration, I think, also, right? And then it was interesting that they also took the pronoun my out. I pledge allegiance to the flag. So all of this was designed to help individuals gravitate towards the idea that it is personal, but it refers specifically to the United States of America.
Yeah, before we get too far away from Bellamy, we're going to be getting here into the 1940s when you're going to see the Congress adopt the national flag code. But nowadays when they say, Pledge of Allegiance, people put their hand over their heart, that kind of thing. But have you seen the original pictures?
Yeah, they called it the Bellamy salute.
Yeah, the Bellamy.
And
What does it look like?
well, yeah, I mean, and I mean, what it did is you extended your hand out, which if anybody was to see that today, their immediately thought would be to, I would not go to the Nazis or to Hitler, that it was a Hail Hitler kind of demonstration. And there are still pictures in existence today of children in American classrooms, with the American flag, and they're outstretched, and they're kind of.
Yeah, but was sort of an innocent thing before the Nazis got hold of it. But when we look at it today, if people were to look at that picture today, just go on Google original pledge salute or Bellamy salute. People look at it today, it's sort of shocking. But back in when it was originally done, late 19th, early 20th century, it was not shocking at that particular point in time. It was a rather innocent thing.
Yeah, I mean, it was because honestly, it wasn't. World War II hasn't even come about. I mean, you're basically still dealing with, the after effects of World War One, but Hitler really hasn't come to power or anything. So it was just the way that he thought of it. This is how I'm going to do it. I'm just going to do that kind of, and it was called the Bellamy salute, but it was not intended for any other purpose than just, you didn't have Nazis back then. You didn't have Hitler. That comes out a little bit later, but I am thankful that you do see people who start to see, oh wait, okay, that this is something that needs to be changed. We need to reduce it.
Change that salute. 1942, it's the 50th anniversary of the Pledge of Allegiance. So Congress passes the National Flag Code or adopts the Pledge of Allegiance as part of the National Flag Code. Now, this is going to create some problems as well, because of course there's some Americans who, for different reasons, and you mentioned earlier, people who struggle with the pledge. There's some Americans who are not comfortable pledging allegiance to a flag like that. And of course, if you do any reading on this issue, Jehovah's Witnesses at this particular point were sort of a central concern there, because they would not pledge allegiance to the flag. And in 1943, um, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Jehovah's Witnesses, did it not?
Well, yeah, you have in 1942 when you have the flag code, but then the Supreme Court has to step in because there was a case in 1940. It was Minersville School District versus Gobitis, which basically it was about forcing students that it was mandatory that all students had to stand up. They had to put their hands over their heart and they had to pledge allegiance to a flag. And you had these individuals who were religious, Jehovah's Witness, and they said, well, wait a second, that goes against my religious beliefs, and I shouldn't have to be able to do that. And I mean, the court in 1940 said, yes, you have to do it. If a teacher asks you to do it, you have to do it. But then you're right. In 1943, there was another Supreme Court case which basically said the free speech clause of the First Amendment prohibits public schools from being able to force students to salute. Or to say the Pledge of Allegiance, and that was that whole idea of freedom of speech and freedom of religion, and now remember, Ray, this is the Pledge of Allegiance that is still not known today because this is going on in the 1940s. There's a key phrase that is missing while these Supreme Court decisions are being made. The whole idea of Jehovah's Witnesses not wanting to say the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag was not about because of God, but it was just because they don't give allegiance to earthly things or to those type of things, and that was their issue. But Ray, then in 1954, that's when we're going to see even more of discord happening between individuals over the pledge.
Yeah, a Catholic organization known as the Knights of Columbus begins campaigning to include the phrase "under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance, and it ultimately would be put in there where it originally said "one nation, indivisible." It said "one nation under God, indivisible," etc. So on June 14, 1954, Republican President Dwight Eisenhower signed the law which added "under one nation under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance. And now we've moved from a group like Jehovah's Witnesses having problems with the pledge to other groups potentially struggling with the idea.
There's an interesting court case. I love talking about it when I'm teaching government or about the Supreme Court, and that's Elk Grove Unified School District versus Newdow, and it was actually in California.
Right.
And it was a case that was brought by an atheist who said that California's school pledge requirement violated his daughter's rights under the First Amendment. He kind of going along the same idea that the Jehovah Witness had. That's kind of what he was going on. And so he takes this all the way to the court and he says, hey, I shouldn't have, my daughter shouldn't have to say the Pledge of Allegiance because it mentions under God. And the Supreme Court, as we've seen them do really well lately, they ducked the issue. They basically, I mean, this was a monumental that the nation was just waiting to see how the Supreme Court was going to do. Mm-hmm. And instead of them voting or determining a ruling on whether or not an school district was going to require students to do it, they kind of ducked it and said, well, you really don't even have the right to bring a suit because you don't have custody over your daughter. And so they kind of left it alone. However, there were three different opinions, separate concurrences, if you will, and that was by the conservative part of the court, who said that teachers should feel that they have the right, it is constitutional, to ask people to say the Pledge of Allegiance, even if the phrase "under God" is in it, because they thought that just saying that it's under God doesn't specify what God. It doesn't specify a particular religion or a denomination, and that's how you kind of get away from it.
Yeah, and different courts have seen challenges to the pledge, the one nation under God part in the pledge since that time, but the courts have sort of held strong on the idea that it does not violate the First Amendment, that it's not a violation of the First Amendment to have that in there. Basically, again, going back to the idea that it's a very generic statement. It's not religion specific.
Yeah, and it's basically become a state issue more than a federal issue. And I there was a case, I think it was recently, it was maybe in 2019, and I don't remember the case, but I wrote down these words because it was the same thing as far as, should students be forced or required to say the Pledge of Allegiance, and this was an appeals court,
Mhm.
and
In
they
Florida.
well, in Florida,
In
yeah, about
Florida.
parental permission. And the quote that I wrote down is that they said that a parent's right to interfere with the wishes of his child is stronger than a public school official's right to interfere on behalf of the school's own interest. And so, therefore, it is up to the parent
Mhm.
whether or not the child will pledge or not. And Ray, why that is so significant is that was in 2019, and we have now seen this major push in education about a parent's bill of rights, and that the parents should have so much control over what their child sees, hears, does in the school system. And I think this bill of rights that's in law now in North Carolina does come as a result of some of these things with the Pledge of Allegiance, that the parents should have the ultimate decision as to whether or not their child should or should not have to do something required by the public school system.
Yeah, so the court system has basically laid this not just at the state's feet, not just at the school's feet, but at the parents' feet. It's up to the individual parent what their child does or does not do in regards to the Pledge of Allegiance. So it's a very interesting topic. One thing I wanted to mention, going back to Bellamy real quick, was his political views. He was an interesting character, a socialist. I think he called himself a Christian socialist at the time.
Yeah, and I can't remember, but really you have this idea of Marxism kind of coming about, and that you start seeing that. And just by the way, being a Christian socialist is very interesting just in
Yeah,
itself.
yeah,
There
yeah.
to go.
But it's interesting to me because you look at some of the stuff they were promoting, this very utopian type of society where people didn't have to work and they didn't have to pay taxes, and yet everybody was going to be equal. It's very interesting stuff to get into in regards to some of his views and what he thought at the time.
Goes into that whole liberty and justice for all thing,
Yeah.
I mean, that whole, all is one is all kind of attitude. But, Ray, I go back and look at this in today's society. Everybody talks about the national anthem, the Colin Kaepernick idea of when he kneeled. And, I saw a commercial not too long ago about this guy who is now selling shoes. But his statement was, I was the only, he plays basketball, I think professional basketball for some team. And he was like, I'm the only one that stood for the national anthem out of my whole team.
Yeah.
Something. And so why don't we see so much controversy about people refusing to stand up and say the Pledge of Allegiance? Why? What's the difference, do you think?
I think part of it may be that the high profile, like sports events and stuff, that's the national anthem, not the pledge. I think that probably has more to do with it.
So why don't we say the pledge every time we say the national anthem?
A good question. I have no idea.
I mean,
That's a good question.
We have so much emphasis on the national anthem, and rightfully so. I'm not trying to disparage that at all, but if we say I pledge allegiance to the flag, is that the problem, that we're pledging allegiance to a flag, and but that flag is resembling of the Star Spangled Banner. I mean, that's where kind of that comes to. America is seen through the flag, but I don't know. I just, it's one of those questions like, why are we not in a tizzy about saying the pledge? Why are we not really all about the pledge, but we are about the Star Spangled Banner? I don't know. It's one of those nobody knows kind of questions, but I do think it's interesting that it's very hefty in the court system, but not really in public opinion. But with me being in the public school system, I see this a lot. And, I mean, public schools still today, let us rise and say the Pledge of Allegiance. And where do you draw the line as far as with a student who does not want to say the pledge, or who is walking and while the pledge is going on, or who sits? I mean, you know, you have to be mindful that things of this nature are important, because the Pledge of Allegiance is something that is so memorable. It is so powerful. It does speak to our identity. However, that whole thing that we talked about with Florida, that ultimately it's the parents' right as to what a child should or should not be required to do.
Yeah, absolutely. It's up to the parents. Have y'all had issues with that, or?
Yeah, so that's the thing. There are several who do not participate in it, who do not stop when it's being done. Everybody around them will, but it's not an issue. It's and I also will say that there are several in at sporting events when the national anthem is played who do not rise, who do not do anything. Nobody talks about that either. So I don't know if that's just because of our location, or if it's but like there's quite a few that do not do the pledge or the national anthem. But I've never had someone voice a concern one way or the other as far as, hey, why do y'all do it every day with the Pledge of Allegiance? Nobody's ever really said that that's a problem. They just choose not to do it if they don't want to do it.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's very interesting. Had not thought about why we put so much emphasis on the anthem and not the pledge. Hadn't really given much thought to the pledge in schools today. I'm not in the public school system, so not exposed to that as much, but it's not something I've given a lot of thought to. So very interesting.
Especially with the idea of, the one nation under God, that whole concept. But more people are concerned about prayer in school than they are about the Pledge of Allegiance in school.
Yeah.
You can talk all day long about people upset about prayer in school, but I have very few conversations about somebody being upset that we say the Pledge of Allegiance every day at school.
Yeah. All right, Chris, thanks for suggesting this topic. I hope our listeners enjoyed this particular episode. I know I did. I learned quite a bit, not only in my research for this episode, but also in just going through it with Chris. Until next time, I'm Ray.
I'm Chris.
And we'll talk to you later.